Hello, it's Richard Watson, and this is l'anglais, the easy way. Today, I'd like to talk about vocabulary. I often get questions like, how should I learn vocabulary? Or how much vocabulary do I need? How many words do I need? I think you've got a good idea what I think about this if you've listened to any of the other episodes, but let's talk about it anyway. I think you probably shouldn't be making lists of vocabulary. For several reasons. First, because they're hard to learn. Memorizing those kind of by-heart systems, they don't work very well, I don't think. And also, it's a bit too simplified. Often when you see a word in a sentence, in that context, it has a particular meaning. And if you just look that word up, you're only capturing one of its possible translations, one of its meanings. And often words are much larger than that, and it's much better to learn them in a context. So I understand that people do need to target vocabulary. We do need to capture vocabulary. We can't just go around not learning. So how do you capture it if you're not making lists? Well, make a compromise. Make a list of sentences. When you see a word, especially in a text, don't copy the word, copy the sentence. The context of the sentence will often help you to understand the word better, to use it better, and especially it will remind you of its meaning without needing to translate very often. If the sentence is a good example sentence, the meaning is clear. And you'll remember it from the sentence, not from the word. That's a much better way. I think learning vocabulary through capturing sentences is also much richer. You end up not just learning a word or two, you end up learning lots of words, reviewing lots of words you know, revising things you kind of knew, and also learning irregular verbs, contractions, auxiliaries, everything else in English. A rich English sentence is full of examples of things you can learn. So every time you read it, you're not learning one word, you're learning a lot of different things. It's much richer, and your brain responds to that very well. So how many words do I need? I hear that a lot. Again, I'll suggest that you go back and listen to the episode about my objectives. If your only objective is to check into a hotel, you probably don't need much. So first of all, decide what you want to do with your English. As always, there's no real reason to learn English unless you have an objective. So you probably have a good idea how I'm going to answer that question. But because I know people do worry about this, you can go online and look for something called frequency lists. And they'll tell you the 500 most popular words, or the 1,000 most common words, or the 5,000 most common words. And you can check if you know them. And you'll be surprised how many you do know. And that's because when you see them, you recognize them. And that brings us to the question of, what does that mean to know a word? Well, often we recognize words that we can't actually find when we're speaking. Or we recognize words that we're not sure how we pronounce. So knowing is actually quite a fluid concept. And frequency lists, all you're doing is recognizing. So that's actually pretty easy. Many of my students can go through a 2,000 or 3,000 or 5,000 word frequency list and know almost all of those words. But they can't use them. And that's when you come to the idea that, in fact, you do know these words. You just don't know how to use them, which means you need to construct a path to find them. That's what learning these words actually means for you now. There's a big difference between passive vocabulary, words you can recognize but don't use, and active vocabulary, words you can use naturally and easily. And your job, in fact, for most French people, because most French people have a lot of vocabulary, and a lot of English words do come from French, their job is not actually to increase their passive vocabulary, it's to increase their active one. It's to activate words, which means constructing trails so that you can find those words. So how do you build these trails? How do you transfer vocabulary from your passive vocabulary to your active vocabulary? Well, it's about frequency, mostly. Again, it comes down to this idea of practice. If you see a word 100 times, there's a good chance you can use it when you need it. If you've only seen it once in the last 3 years, even if you can recognize it, you might not think to use it. I think that's the first way. It's about real tasks, reading and listening, not expressing yourself, although that comes in later for sure. It's about reading and listening enough that you actually encounter more and more words, more and more structures, more and more frequently. And the good news for people out there who think that they can't understand when they listen, well, I've got good news. Just because you don't understand doesn't mean your brain is not working. I have some kind of personal proof on that. As I've mentioned before, I came to France with no French, started working with very simple, formalized cassettes of a method. And as soon as I could, I started listening to France Info because it repeats all the time. And back then there was no internet, so I knew that every 20 minutes, all of the audio files would repeat, basically. And once I was getting better and better at that, I switched over to France Inter. And I basically listened to France Inter all the time at home. And at first, I understood virtually nothing. And then, little by little, you realize you do understand more. How it's working, it's not obvious. But little by little, you seem to follow what they're saying better. You recognize words that you didn't recognize before. And it's, for me at least, proof that your brain is constantly grinding on things you hear. Just because you don't understand, it doesn't mean your brain is not working on it. That's my experience. So that means you should be listening. You should be exposing yourself to English as much as you can. There's no way around it. There's no way of learning without that difficulty. We often say that you can't learn to swim if you're constantly holding on to the edge of the pool. Okay, dive into English films, dive into English videos, dive into English podcasts, and you won't drown. Go and try it. See how much you can get. Don't be frustrated if you don't understand everything. Catch what you can, and don't stress. That's my advice to you. Thank you very much for your time. As always, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes, and I'll catch you next time.